Hey YouTubers, welcome back to John's Garage. So today we're going to put a set of valve cover gaskets on this 3.2 Acura TL. It is a 2000 model year. So you want to do this occasionally, maybe every 50 to 100,000 miles, to prevent oil leaks inside your spark plug tubes and oil leaks from coming down here. Like I say, start high, work down to find oil leaks. We're going to change the valve cover gaskets today and also adjust the valves while we're in there. It's a pretty big job to get torn down to get inside there. So once we got it open, we're going to put in a fresh set of gaskets, and we're also going to adjust the valve lash. And it's like I say, plan on 3 to 4 hours depending on how much cleaning you want to do as you go. Okay, so 10 millimeter on the 4 corners, lefty loosey. Okay, flat screwdriver here, half turn on these two, take that right off, take that right off. So next thing we're going to do is take the ear box and snorkel off. So the ear box is just a number 2 Phillips. You can use a socket if you have the right size, or just a number 2 Phillips. It's 4 screws. Okay, this cruise control cable is just held in place like that. Get out of the way. Airbox is almost loose. Okay, that's loose. Now there's a screw right here for the throttle body intake. Number 2 Phillips. Little hose out of the way. Pull this hose out. There. Okay, there's one more hose on the back. This unplugs. And should be able to wiggle this guy out. Wait a minute. This connector here, get that out of there. It's held in right there. Okay, that's out of the way. Protect your paint on your fender. And we can leave our air cleaner element in place. We're just going to take the throttle cables off next so that we can get into here. So number 2 Phillips, 2 screws here that hold these cables. Then you pull this back and undo the end of it. So let me get those screws off. Okay, so we pulled the throttle forward and we got the Two little ends off there. That's what they look like. Set that aside. Now we're going to take the top cover off the intake. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 millimeter nuts. Oh, actually they're bolts, so a couple of them are nuts, some are bolts. This one's the nut. I won't bore you while I'm unscrewing all 10 of those. Okay, so we got the 8 bolts and 2 nuts off. Let's take this top cover off. And this is what is known as the beehive to Acura Honda technicians. So this can get all gummed up with carbon and it needs to be cleaned if you got EGR problems. And this is a metal gasket that is reusable, and it does need to fit one way. Set this cover down. So I notice this end has to go towards the throttle body. Don't turn it this way, get it upside down, because you'll see some cutouts here and they have to match up. Don't turn it over the wrong way. It'll be apparent to you when it's the wrong way. Mechanics have done that time and time again. They've gone, well, I guess you can't go this way with it, the holes don't line up, but you could accidentally put it that way, which would be really not good. So I'll set these aside, but this is the beehive that occasionally needs cleaning. This one, the passageways, even though they're black, they're not plugged anywhere, so I've cleaned that before. There's a couple things in the back to unhook. There's a vacuum line here to unhook. There we go. So that hit the ground at least. So I'll get that off the floor. Okay, so this vacuum hose is actually the positive crankcase ventilation valve, PCV. So we'll set that aside. So we have a air intake temperature sensor to unplug here. Just squeeze the connector and pull it off. Got a vacuum line here, skinny one. Just put that up here so I don't forget to plug it back in. And we got a, looks like a brake booster vacuum line. Okay, so that's off. Okay. So now there are several bolts. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolts and 2 nuts down inside there. They're a little bit oily, but we will take those off. So these are 12 millimeter. And they're on there pretty good. And they are torqued with a pattern, so let's get all those out. Okay, since it got a little greasy and oily, you know what really works as a good hand cleaner? Windex. Spray it on a paper towel, wipes all the grease and oil right off your hands. Little plug for Windex. Okay, so we got 2 more electrical connectors on the throttle body, throttle position sensor, and then the idle air control valve, IAC. That's the bottom one. And that has been replaced on this car probably a year or so ago. That's a little tight. Let me get a screwdriver to wedge in there. Okay, so idle air, throttle body, throttle position sensor, those are unplugged, out of the way. Got all of our nuts and bolts in there loose. And looks like we have one more vacuum line right here to come off. Some pliers. Okay, one more vacuum line to take off here. Boy, that rubber hose is getting pretty dried out. Not so flexible anymore. That's okay. It doesn't need to move, so we'll just set that aside. And back here by the air intake temperature sensor, there's a little vacuum line right underneath it. Right there, just pulled that off. I think everything is loose now. There is a water line right here to the idle air control valve. I'm going to see if we can leave that. I'm going to take off the 12 millimeter nuts. There's 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, and just remove the throttle body because it's all disconnected except for the water and the coolant. So we can take out those 4 nuts and then pull this about 2 inches to get it off of those studs, and then just set it here. Then we'll be clear to remove the intake manifold. Okay, the top 2 are nuts, and the bottom 2 are long bolts. So let's get those out. So we got the 2 nuts and the 2 bolts out. They're all 12 millimeter. Now we're just going to slide this forward and pull it off. There's 2 water hoses underneath it, and they're not very long, so it's going to be tight. Might have to actually lift the intake manifold a little bit and pull the opposite way of pulling this to separate the 2. Because I just don't want to undo the water lines. Okay, without taking off the manifold, I was able to slide it off those 2 top studs, tilting it down a little bit and pulling it off, and just set the throttle body aside. And you know, you could clean it while you got it out, paper towel and some gum out or something, but throttle body cleaner. This one's been cleaned before, it's not too bad. You can clean the front side. Front side's pretty clean. Back side is usually a little more dirty, but you can clean that while it's out of there. And you can see the 2 water lines there, 1, 2, in and out. So there is a gasket on here. It did not tear. That's good. It's a relatively new gasket. And if it tears, then that's the time to replace it. They're only like $1 or something. Okay, so we're about to lift the intake manifold off. I want to make sure I gave you the right count before. So there's, as far as bolts, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then nuts, there's 1 at each end, 2. So there's 7 bolts and 2 nuts. So we'll set those aside, and then we'll lift this intake manifold by holding these 2 throttle body studs on this side and this little boss tab on the other side. It's already loose, we'll just lift it off of there. Okay, so lifted the intake manifold off, set it on the floor. It's one big piece. I don't know, probably weighs 20 pounds. And now we got the lower intake. And you want to cover these with some paper towels or cloth or something. You do not want nuts, bolts, tools falling down inside there. That would be... Okay, now we're going to use a number 6 hex key to loosen the set screws for the coils. Let's just unplug each of these, squeeze the connector, pull up. Do that for all 6. Since this is a Japanese car, of course this, when I said number 6, I mean 6 millimeter metric hex key. So we got the set screw out, and for the coil, just give it a little wiggle, slide it out. And you want to make sure that this boot comes out with the coil. Make sure it's not stuck down there on the spark plug. So we need to get this rail out of the way that holds the electrical connectors for the coils. So this is 10 millimeter. Just 2 bolts hold that in. Swing this up and out of the way somewhere, over by the battery. So let's get this air hose off of here. that'll be fine. Let's get that out of the way there. Now we take these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bolts off. They are 10 millimeter. They're going to have rubber grommets on them, and in the kit from Fel-Pro there are new grommets included, and I'll show you the trick to getting those over the bolts, because there's quite a trick to get that rubber piece over that wide spot. So I'll show you how to do that by threading it in and lube the rubber up, and then we'll thread it in, push it over. I'll clean this up first. Okay, so this one here is the only short one. So the others are the same length. This is the short one. So I'm gonna mark that here, indicating that it's short, so when I reassemble, I remember that's where the short one goes. Okay, so I have marked that, so I know which one has the short bolt. Now we can just pull this up and off. There we go. So that's what it looks like. There's some rubber O-rings here that we're going to replace, and there's a rubber gasket around here that we're going to replace. So that's what a 600,000 mile engine looks like with frequent oil changes at 3,000 miles. This is a sideways V6 engine, 3.2 liters with 4 valves per cylinder. So you have 2 intake, 2 exhaust. This is cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is cylinder 4. And you got 2 intake, 2 exhaust. And the camshaft goes right through there. And this is a VTEC engine. So based on oil pressure, there's a VTEC actuator, and then it can move on to different cam lobes at higher RPMs. So we're not messing with VTEC today. The only thing we have to do today is replace the valve cover gasket, because we don't want any leaks that are coming along this edge here. Some of this is road grime and some might be leaking oil. Remember what I said about finding an oil leak? Start high, eliminate all leaks up high, because you could have oil dripping down that you think is your oil pan because it gets to the bottom and it's not your oil pan leaking. It could be the valve cover gasket leaking. So start high when looking for leaks. And when we adjust these valves, we are going to look at the hood. It says valve lash intake. Looks like, let me get that close up of that for you. So on this hood it says cold, so we have to have a dead cold engine. Valve lash intake is, let's see, 0.22 plus or minus 0.02 millimeter. Exhaust is 0.30 plus or minus 0.02. So on our feeler gauges we want a 0.22 for the intake and a 0.30 millimeter for the exhaust. Okay, so the other thing that you want to take care of when doing the valve cover gasket is, this is the number 2 cylinder coil. There's a little bit of oil that got through into the cylinder, not much, but because oil can go, I'll show you on the front bank, there's an oil seal around here on the valve cover, and if that goes bad, oil can come from here and get into there, and that could affect your spark. So if this was swimming in oil, that could be a problem. There's just a tiny bit. It doesn't look like it got up inside, so we caught this in time, and we'll be taking care of that problem today. The rear valve cover is a little harder to get off because you got this power steering in the way. There's a 10mm bolt right here that we can take out, and you got this electrical in the way, so there's a 10mm bolt we can take out, and both of these can just be pushed up enough to pull this up and out. Okay, so the same thing on the rear bank. This one here is the only one with a short bolt, so I'm going to put some tape and mark that as well on the rear bank. Okay, so on the plastic electrical rail, there's actually two bolts. There's one over here. I just taped it up here so I can remember to put it in later. And there's also one right here. So you need to get this one out as well. And then we can lift up the electrical and get that out of the way. Okay, so I just used a piece of string, lifted this up and just tied it out of the way. And we should have enough clearance to lift this cover up and out of there. There we go. We've got all 5 bolts out. That gasket is sticking on there, so that's okay. We're going to replace it with a new gasket. Like I said, this back one is a little harder to get out because of all the wiring. There we go. I got that out. So the back one, because it has the positive crankcase ventilation right here, that's where the PCV valve plugs in. The back one's not so pretty with all the miles. It's got some varnish buildup from oil fumes. It's a pollution control requirement since 1972 or 74. So we'll clean it up as best we can. That's just what happens with high mileage. So on the front bank, I'm going to take off this cover. There's 5 bolts that are 10mm, and then you slide it up and then away. Well, there's the dipstick for the oil that's in the way, so we might have to loosen that bolt. Let's see if we get it out by wiggling it a little more. Yeah, it looks like the dipstick's not the only problem. This belt is also a little bit in the way, so I might have to loosen the belt to get it off. Let me do a little more wiggling. Okay, so I got the bolt out for the dipstick. You know, it's really unfortunate. If Honda had just made this dipstick tube 1 inch shorter, and the dipstick, you know, the stopper on it would be adjusted for that 1 inch shorter. If it was 1 inch shorter, then this cover would clear it without having to remove that bolt that's really hard to reach. So we have had to remove the power steering belt and the bolt for the dipstick tube just to get this to clear the pulley. What a pain. So there's 5 bolts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then this cover comes off. There is a little window that you could look through here, but I've never found that very useful. And for this video, I want to have the pulley exposed so I can make it clear to you what we are doing on the pulley. So shame on Honda for making that dipstick tube. You know, the tube doesn't have to be that tall. 1 inch shorter would have been fine. You can still have the dipstick coming up to here, just have the tube shorter and the stopper further down on the same dipstick. It doesn't make any sense why Honda did that. So what we want to do is move the engine so that we have this number 1. There's markings on here around, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on this pulley, and I'll show them to you with a close-up in a minute. We want this number 1 top dead center straight up and down so that we can do our number 1 cylinder valves back here. We need number 1 at top dead center. Just like when you're putting on a timing belt or anything else, or statically setting your ignition timing, you want number 1 first, top dead center. So we have our right front tire. We turn the steering wheel all the way to the right, and we have 19mm socket through that hole there. It's flexible plastic, so you just push through. And we got some extension bars, and we got a torque wrench. If I get far enough back to show you what we got here. So the car's on the ground, so turn the steering wheel all the way to the right and put your 19mm with some extensions. I just used a floor jack to make it easier to turn this. And we want to turn clockwise until we got number 1 at top dead center. In this case, I'm going to go a little bit counterclockwise to take a shortcut to get started. So I'll go a little bit past it. There, a little past it. Now I'm going to go clockwise. So on this wrench, I'm going to push clockwise on it towards the front of the car, be clockwise. And then I'm going to watch the marks on here line up, going clockwise, clockwise. We want to be straight on looking at that. Get the dipstick out of the way here. Let's see if I can get the camera in there. There. Okay, number 1. And you see the number 1 marker on the pulley. Let it focus there. Let me get some more light for you. Number 1. And we want that to be lined up with top dead center. Now we are ready to set the number 1 intake and exhaust. So on this engine, see if we can focus on this paper here. We always want to turn the engine clockwise, and the firing order is 1, 4, 2, 5, 3, 6. So if you look at the engine with the rear cylinders, number 1, 2, 3, front bank 4, 5, 6, and this is where the belts are on this side. So we're going to set, just like we set on the firing order, we're going to set, hopefully that's in focus, we're going to set number 1 intake and exhaust, 4, 2, 5, 3, 6. That's how this Acura engine fires. So we're going to do top dead center, then we're going to rotate the engine to number 4 that's marked on that cam pulley. When that's straight up and down, top dead center, we'll do number 4. We look for the number 4 on that cam pulley. So 1, 4, 2, 5, 3, 6. And each time we have to rotate the engine clockwise until we see this number 4 on the cam pulley, then number 2 on the cam pulley, number 5 on the cam pulley, number 3 on the cam pulley, number 6. And we're going to set our intake to 0.20 millimeter, exhaust 0.30 millimeter, and you can be plus or minus 2. So on that 0.20 you could be 0.18 to 0.22, that's plus or minus 2. And the exhaust 0.28 to 0.32. So let's get started on setting these valve clearances. It's going to take about an hour to do. You got 24 valves, and it'll take about an hour. It took us 45 minutes to an hour for the teardown, an hour for setting the lash clearances, and then maybe an hour or less to put everything back together. Okay, so I got my feeler gauges. I wish I had longer ones, but when those big YouTube checks start rolling in someday, hopefully, I'll get some better feeler gauges. So these are metric, so we got 0.20 millimeters going to be our intake. And so the ones closest to the intake manifold, that's your clean air coming in, so that's intake. And the ones by the exhaust manifold, that's your exhaust down here. So intake, exhaust. Same in the back. Close to the intake is your intake valves and exhaust. So it's easier to show you on the front, but I'm not on the number 4 cylinder yet. So you slip this under here, and of course we're not aligned on the right cylinder, but you slip this under just so it moves, if it's lubricated with oil. It'll move in without binding. If it's stuck, then you have to undo the nut here, and then use a screwdriver and turn that a little bit. Now in valve adjustments, you should never have to make radical adjustments. If you do, you might be on the wrong cylinder. So these should need very minor adjustments, if any at all. Okay, so check to make sure you're on the right cylinder on this cam pulley mark when you're working on it, to make sure you're not doing radical adjustments, because you might be just doing the wrong thing. So just a refresher before we start, if we look at our timing mark, get a bright light down there. Look at our timing mark down there. Move the camera in there. There we go. Can you see that arrow lined up with the crank pulley? And we are at top dead center on the crank, and we are at number 1 on the cam pulley. So we're definitely on number 1. So we're going to go over here to number 1 and do the intake valves first, then the exhaust valves. So 0.20, 0.30, just like it said on the sticker up there, for intake and exhaust. So here I've got the 0.20 feeler on an intake valve, and it's good. It's just grabbing just enough as I move it in there. It's not binding and it's not super loose. So this one on number 1 looks good, and there's 2 valves for intake and 2 for exhaust, so you got to do both of them. It's a little hard to get in there, that's why I wish I had longer feeler gauges, but do your best to get that feeler gauge in there as best you can. So if you have to adjust any of them, I use a 10 millimeter socket to bust it loose, and then when I go to adjust it, I'll use, like this, a 10 millimeter, and I'll get it adjusted where I want with the feeler gauge. So I have the feeler gauge under there, and I'll adjust it where I want it, and then I'll hold it with the screwdriver, and then I'll tighten the nut, because if you tighten it like this, it could move the screw. So get the screw adjustment where you want it, hold the screwdriver, and then tighten the nut. Okay, I was out of frame with that, but put your feeler gauge, tighten to where you want it, and then hold the screwdriver and then lock the nut, and then check with your feeler gauge one more time to make sure it's where you want it. Because once you're done with a cylinder and you go to the next one, you can't go back unless you crank all the way around again to that cylinder. So you want to make sure all 4 valves are right on number 1 cylinder before going to the next one. Okay, now we're going to crank the engine clockwise to number 4. So that would be the next position on the pulley. Okay. Show you that up close if I can. So there's a number 4 there, and we're going with that square indentation and lining that up with the mark up there. So we have that exactly on number 4. Okay, since we're on the front number 4 cylinder, it's intake 0.20, so I'll show you how I do this. This gauge just slides under there. It's not binding. When you use these gauges a lot, they get curved, and that's good because that's the shape you want to get it under there. So that's good. We don't need to adjust that. It's not binding, it's not super loose. So that's good. Now let's do the exhaust. Switch feeler gauges here. Exhaust. Wiggle that under there. That feels good too. A little more light for you there. So that feels good. Should just be able to push it under and move it without binding. If it's totally jammed, when it's lubricated, it's got some oil on there. If it's totally jammed, you need to loosen it. If it's way too loose, there's no resistance, you need to tighten it. Let me get around the other side where I can reach that better. And the exhaust now. I don't know if I was out of frame on that last one, probably. So stick that feeler gauge under there. It just fits under there. Tiny bit of resistance. It's not too loose, too tight. There we go. So let's do the one right next to it. Get our feeler gauge underneath there. We gotta kind of work at it to get it under there because these are a little stubby and I wish I had longer ones. Okay, this one's not going under so easy. There we go. Okay, so it's going under there and there's not a lot of resistance. There's a little bit of oil on there and it's sliding under pretty good. So we don't need to adjust this. Okay, so intake are done, exhaust are done. We're done with number 4 cylinder. So now we're going to move on to number 2, which is the middle one in the back. So middle in the back where that screwdriver's pointed at. That'll be our next one, but we got to rotate the engine and get the front cam pulley to say number 2 on it with the top mark lined up. Now we rotated our engine clockwise and we watched the front cam and we got this number 2. You see how the letters are off a little bit. They're not centered, so we go with the square mark because right above it in the tooth there's a very fine little line there. That's the mark. And we go across and line it up with that mark in the cam cover. So we are on number 2, which is the middle cylinder in the back. So we're going to adjust the intake and exhaust on number 2. Okay, we finished number 2. Now we're going to go to number 5. So let's rotate the engine to number 5. Okay, so we're going to rotate to number 5. Close up there, get some light on it. So there is number 5. We're going to go with the square mark there, because there's a little fine line right above that square, a fine mark in the tooth, and that tooth lines up with the white mark in our cam cover. So we are number 5. And number 5, if we look at the engine, it is the center one front bank, because remember we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so 5 is the middle one. Okay, so we just finished number 5. Now we're going to do number 3 on the rear bank. So we're going to rotate clockwise. Rotate, rotate. And we have, if I could focus on that, number 3, and that mark is lined up. So we are on cylinder 3, and the square mark is lined up. Okay, we finished with number 3 cylinder. Now we're going to do number 6, which is the last cylinder. So clockwise. Show you close up. Too close. Cylinder 6. So that mark just above the number 6 on the tooth is lined up with the white mark, so we're ready to do number 6 valve adjustment. And number 6 is the furthest from the belts on the front. Just remember how it goes: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the rotation is starting with number 1. So the rotation goes 1, 4, 2, 5, 3, 6. So we're on number 6, which is the last one on the front bank. Okay, so now we're ready to put in our new valve cover gaskets. Got this Fel-Pro kit from Autozone. It is VS50576R, and that is for the 3.2 Acura TL. And it comes with 2 valve cover gaskets, 10 valve grommet gaskets, and 6 spark plug tube seals. So first thing we got to do is pull the old grommets and gasket off of the old one. So let me show you how to do that. You could buy a oil seal puller, or you could just use a screwdriver. But I'll show you how that's done here. Work your way around. Try it with a kind of a wide flat screwdriver. And these things, if you pull at them, they're just going to tear apart. So work your way around. There we go. And it just pops out. So compare that with the new one. They look pretty similar. The old one's a little worn in the middle. These are actually Acura and these are Fel-Pro. So we'll clean that and we'll take the gasket off the outside too. Take that off. It's not glued in place, it's just fitted. Well, you can see this one was, number 2 was leaking, and this, when I pulled the cover off, this thing went inward, so looks like it didn't have the best of seal anymore. So wiggle that one out. Number 2 is the one that got a little bit of oil down in the spark tube, but not a whole lot. So you get the point. Just work those out, and then I'll show you how to put the new ones in. If you got an oil seal puller, like this one, see if I'm in frame. This oil seal puller looks like this. You can use that as well. You can fit it in there and work your way around. There we go. Screwdriver might tend to put some little marks on there. That's not a machine surfaced for any real purpose, because when these are in, there's a little gap anyway, but you can use this to get under that edge if you got some space there. Because these don't sit all the way flush. So I've got a little gap in this one. There we go. So this won't leave screwdriver marks on that surface there, but like I say, it's not a big deal because these don't sit all the way down in there. When you put the new ones in, you just push them in a little ways, and you don't push them all the way down in. Just put them in a little ways. You might put a little motor oil on there, push them in a little bit, and then when you tighten these down, put the valve cover on, tighten it down, it's going to seat it the rest of the way that it needs to go without. If you push this in all the way down to that surface, I'll show you the screwdriver. If you're all the way down to that surface, these things are going to leak. So don't push them all the way in. Okay, for the front valve cover, we got the gasket in, a little tab goes on the outside, and just press it in. And then these, with the crown up and the flap down in there like that, these are just pressed in by finger. You don't need to hammer them in. So just press them in, put a little oil on them, press them in by finger, get them even as you can. Now we're ready to put it on the car. Okay, so we're ready to put the front valve cover on the head. Just push these wires out of the way and set it on there as evenly as you can. Spark plug holes are going to have to line up. So look in those holes and line them up and push them through. It's flexible rubber, so it's going to push through there. There we go. So we got the 3 holes. This is cylinders 4, 5, 6. And the rubber did not bind at all when it went on. Now I'm going to show you how to do the grommets for the bolts. Okay, the Fel-Pro kit comes with a bag of new grommets with the metal. It's not as shiny. I might keep the old metal. Okay, so for the old ones, I just use a screwdriver to pry between the rubber and the metal. And then you got that separated, get some wire cutters. You're not using this anymore, so just cut that rubber part off and throw that rubber part away and keep this, clean it off, and we're going to reuse it. That, if you want to take it off, you can. The rubber part, I'll show you how to get that on, the new rubber part. So the way I get the new rubber on, here's the new one. Put it over like that, and then I'll take the metal ring from the old one and just put it like that. It's temporary. You take this and you thread it in like that. Just start cranking it in there until it seats over that wide spot. There we go. It's on. Now you can unthread that. And this is the old piece you don't need. Oops, out of focus there. So it's on there now. We don't need this old piece anymore. So the new one, getting over that wide spot, the trick is just thread it in where it belongs on the engine. You know, we go in one of these. I'm sorry, one of these here. That's the short one. There we go in here. So that's where it would go. But just thread it over one of these with the old metal pushing. Any of these three would fit fine. Just thread it in. The rubber pops right over, and it's on. That is the trick to getting those on there. And now it's ready to go. There's your new one. Okay? Okay, so we got the front valve cover gasket on, and we torque these down in a crisscross pattern. These are designed to bottom all the way out. So as you're hand torquing them, they are going to bottom out, and that's how you know when you're done. I noticed these Fel-Pro grommets kind of bulge out. You can see the blue around there. I guess that's the way they're designed. Never noticed that with the factory Honda Acura ones. They're black and they don't seem to bulge out like that. But anyway, these bolts, I'll show you one of the old ones. See, they are designed to, when you thread them in, they have a stop. That's that wide spot right there. They are designed to bottom out. Don't torque them any more than that. You'll bend them or break them. But just hand tighten them until they stop. Then you know you're done. And that's going to put the right compression on these grommets and the gasket that's around the whole thing. So you shouldn't have any leaks if you torque them down that way, just till they bottom out. So now would be a good time to do spark plug replacement, but we just did these a couple of weeks ago, so we're good on spark plugs. We don't need to change them. They're all brand new. So I just threw the coils back in, number 4, 5, 6. Put the set screw in. I guess we can put the electrical connectors back over here. Get those bolts. Okay, we put these two 10mm bolts in. Connect our coils. So let's start working on the rear valve cover, putting the new gasket and spark plug seals in. Okay, I took the rear valve cover outside and degreased it and scraped it with a screwdriver, got as much sludge as I could off of there, and rinsed it as good as I could to get all the cleaning solution off. And that's what it looks like now. So it doesn't look as bad as when it came off. There's a lot of sludge in there. So that's as clean as I can get it for now, using just chemicals that I had here. Mostly a purple power degreaser and some Windex. And toothbrush, scrubbed and scrubbed, scrape with a screwdriver to get the big deposits off. And dried it in the sun. Make sure I got all the chemicals off of it. So it looks like it's ready to put gaskets on and then go back in the car. Okay, so we got the rear valve cover on. We put the 5 bolts in. This is the short one. Just like on the front, we have a short one. So short and short. Everything else is long. We put the coils in. We put the bolt for the bracket that holds the power steering, 10mm bolt. Put a 10mm bolt for the electrical here and here. Connected our coils, put the set screws in, and Now we are ready to put other things on. So over here we need to put this cover on, but first, let's see, I guess the first thing would be to put the cover and the 5 bolts, because that we had problems with the belts and the oil dipstick being in the way. So let's put this plastic cover on and 5 bolts first. Then we'll put the bolt for the dipstick, and then we'll put our belts back on and do the adjustment on this belt. Okay, so here's our cover that was a giant pain to get off. 5 bolts, and they're all the same. There are these little guys here, 10 millimeter, 5 of those. They're all the same. And the cover, remember, it has a notch in the bottom here, so it slides down. So push down on it and then put the bolts in. Okay, so we got the front cam sprocket cover on. We got the 5 bolts in there, 10 millimeter bolts. Now let's put the oil dipstick bolt in there, and it is a 10 millimeter. Okay, so now we got the oil dipstick in. It's time to put the alternator belt back on. So this is my special tool from JTC Auto Tools, number 3212, 14 millimeter, 0 offset. That's the key. It's really long. So we're going to push this power steering forward, towards the driver's side, and get this 14 millimeter on there, and then push it towards the firewall back like that. Put the belt on with your other hand, and then let go of the tension, and that will automatically tension the belt. So I'm going to do that off camera real quick. Okay, this alternator belt is a grooved belt, and it also drives the air conditioner, so make sure the grooves are set properly on the alternator, the air conditioner, and the crank pulley. There's 3 pulleys that those grooves have to be on properly. So let go of the tensioner, check the belt. If you got to adjust it, push the tension off, adjust it with your other hand, and then let go of the wrench again. Okay, so now we're putting the power steering pulley back on. The belt. Power steering belt back on. And this is also a grooved belt, ribbed belt, whatever you want to call it. So make sure it's on the top and the bottom, so the crank pulley and the power steering, and then turn the adjuster nut, lifting up on the pump. Turn the adjuster nut by hand until you get as much slack out of it as you can. And then check the belt, top and bottom, make sure it's on the pulley in the grooves. So this adjusting nut is 12 millimeter deep socket. So adjust that until the belt is tight. You want to have no more than a 1/2 inch deflection at the middle of the longest spot when you press on it. So need a lot more tightening than that. More tightening. So now there are 2 other bolts that need to be tightened. Well, one's a nut. So Let me get a bright flashlight so I can show you down there where those lock. This is the adjuster we just did. Now we're going to lock it in place. So that's our adjusting nut. And then below that, right there, is one locking nut. And then over on the other side of the pulley is the other so that's the bracket locking bolt. So after it's adjusted, you lock that in. Okay, so now it's time to put the intake manifold on. So let's get rid of this tape that's covering the lower intake manifold. That made a nice little work surface. Also kept stuff from falling in. Okay, so let's put our metal gasket on. Make sure all the holes are lined up. That looks good, everything's lined up. Okay. Okay, so in here is 12 millimeter nuts and bolts. There's 2 nuts and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolts. So torque them in a crisscross pattern. Okay, so I cleaned up the metal gasket for the beehive. So let's put this on the correct way. It goes exactly like this. This square here, these EGR passages, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they all line up. We can check those, see? They line up. EGR, EGR, EGR. Those have to be clear, the car won't run right. So that gasket is clean. Now let's clean the beehive. So this is the beehive before cleaning. These passages have to be clear for the EGR ports. There are 6 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And all these passages have to be clear. There's a lot of carbon in there, you can see. So I'm going to scrape out the carbon, degrease it, use a little screwdriver, and clean as much as I can of this thing. Sorry about being out of frame. So cleaning all these passages so the EGR ports 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, those all have to be clear so that the gases can get to those and go down to the EGR. So there's a lot of carbon in here. I'm cleaning it up as best I can. Okay, so I went outside and cleaned the beehive, and here's what it looks like after cleaning. I think it looks pretty good in comparison to what it was. All the passageways to the EGR ports are all clean, so this is ready to go back on the car. We got our clean gasket there. So this goes on this direction. And we put our nuts and bolts on. We got a bolt and a nut and a nut, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 screws. So 8 screws, 2 nuts, all 10 millimeters. So torque these in a crisscross pattern. Okay, so put the intake manifold on. 2 nuts, 2 bolts, 12 millimeter, torque it down. Okay, now let's put on the throttle cable. 2 Phillip screws, put on the bracket, and then put the cables on. There's 2 cables, one for the cruise control, one for the gas. Okay, so back here we plugged in our air hose, another air hose, electrical connector, and a little tiny air hose, and then our positive crankcase ventilation is pushed in. So that's all connected back there. Now we'll go over by the EGR and do some connections. We got several connections here. So we got our idle air control valve. Get this out of the way. There we go. So this, I'll put it on last. Okay. Idle air control valve is on. Throttle position sensor is on. Coolant temperature sensor plugged in. EGR plugged in. And then this air hose to the front valve cover. Let me get pliers for that clamp. Keep that clamp out of the way so you don't cut yourself when you're turning the oil cap. So now we're ready for the snorkel air intake. So we'll do that next. So for the snorkel air intake, be careful not to chip up the fender. This is relatively new, so it's still rubbery instead of hard as a rock like the old one was. Get pliers for that clamp. Okay. Air hose in. Another air hose on the other side, plugged in. this electrical through. This is the MAP sensor, MAP. This car does not have a MAF, it has a MAP, manifold absolute pressure sensor. That's what that is. I connect this air hose in front. Put that clamp on. Put this clamp on. This hose is routed wrong. You need to go across the top. Move that. Okay, we rerouted this one across the top. So this goes in here in this holder, and in this holder, and on there. And move that clamp back on. So now that is the correct routing. Now take our number 2 Phillips and tighten our snorkel clamp. Okay, and now we'll tie this down. This is our cruise control cable, so we'll tighten that down with a strap. Okay, now for the front beauty cover. Screws in at 12 o'clock position, turn 90 degrees to the 3 o'clock position, and that one's not going in. There we go. Now for the top beauty cover. Four screws, 4 bolts, and they are all 10 millimeter. It's just plastic cover. We don't need to torque it a lot, just to keep the cover from blowing away. Torque all 4 of them. Okay, now the beauty cover's on. So, look around, see if no spare parts. Everything should be buttoned up now for a test drive. Okay, let's cold start this thing, see what it sounds like. Okay, sounds good. I think we can call that job done.